Hello everyone, my name is Gemini, and welcome to my video on the mechanics behind army control. So if you're a low leaguer, and you're asking for advice on army control, you're oftentimes told by people, myself included sometimes, to just A move, and that army control isn't really important compared to macro. To a certain extent, this is true, but army control is still something that's very important to talk about, especially for people that want to progress into the Diamond Master or even Grandmaster leagues, or anyone that just wants to actually improve their army control a little bit instead of just A moving. This video will serve as an introduction to these mechanics and processes behind army control. Since this is a longer video and you may not necessarily want to watch the entire thing, there are timestamps in the description that you can jump to for the different points I'll be talking about. Some of those points are setting up control groups and the different methods of controlling an army. I'll be talking specifically how to move larger armies with those control groups. I'll talk about setting up for engagements, enacting the engagements, and retreating from the engagements. And I'll be focusing a lot on prioritization and what that means in a fight in relation to the mechanics behind it. So the first point I'm going to touch on is actually setting up the control groups that you'll have and the different methods that you can go about controlling an army. Generally, the most important thing that a lot of players will tell you when it comes to army control is that it's best to have multiple different control groups for your army. Generally, you don't want to do what is called one hotkey syndrome, where everything is on one hotkey and thus making it more difficult to control larger amounts of units. So, the best way to go about doing this is to set up your hotkeys so that way you have different spellcasters or different important units on different control groups. The most common thing is to put everything on one and then segment the most important spellcaster unit onto two, or whatever two hotkeys that you choose to use. You can use 4 or 5, 6 and 7, it doesn't matter. For me personally, I do 1 and 2 and 3 for my 3 main control groups for my army. So everything on 1, then the most important spellcaster on 2. So a lot of times this will end up being something like High Templar or Disruptors or maybe Phoenix in an early game. So you always want to make sure that you have these different control groups to make late game army control a little bit easier for those different engagements. If you don't want to do that, you still technically can get away with using only one army hotkey. You just have to be very good at tabbing. And what tabbing is, for people unaware, is that using the default key tab, it allows you to cycle through the selection in your actual entire selection that you have. So say you have Blink Stalkers, Sentries, and High Templar. If you press tab, it will tab between the Blink Stalkers, the Sentries, and the High Templar. So that way then you can use them all each individually while still having them all on one control group. While this is technically a less efficient way of doing an army control because you're still on only one hotkey and it's much more difficult to move 2 different sets of units individually from each other, it still allows you to control a larger army if you're uncomfortable with using multiple different hotkey setups. You can also use a hybrid system if you want. Say you only want to use 2 different control groups and it's very difficult for you to use more than that for your army. Or maybe you don't have the space on your layout to actually do so. So you can have the most important spellcaster on one hotkey by itself, and then the rest of your spellcasters all together with the rest of your army on one control group. You can very easily just use the second control group to micro the most prioritized units individually, and then you can use tab in your main army control group to then cycle through those units to make it a little bit easier to manage if you do not have all the control groups available to you. For the sake of this video and the future examples that I'll be talking about, they will all be referencing my own hotkey setup just because it's more natural to me and it's a bit easier to do so. So that way you know what I'm talking about. These are the control groups that I split my army up into. I mostly use number 1, 2, and 3 for my army control groups. 1 is my main army control group. I like to refer to this as the A move control group pretty much because it's all the units that you can very easily just A move at the beginning of a fight. You're not really thinking too much about them. The only one that is not like that technically is the Sentry because it has Guardian Shield and Force Field, but it does default over all the rest of the units in that control group. And for the most part, you're just A moving Sentries anyway, except for those 2 spells at the very beginning. So it's not really a big issue to have those with the rest of the A movie type of units. My second control group is the primary spellcaster that I need to individually micro compared to the rest of the A move composition. So usually this will be High Templar that are split up. There'll be Disruptors. There'll be Phoenix, like I was saying before. A lot of times maybe it'll be an Oracle so that I can constantly revelate an army. Sometimes I'll also move the Oracle onto another hotkey as well. But generally this is the control group that is still reserved for units that are extremely important to my army composition, but still need to be microed separately and individually from the A move group. The third army control group is basically just like the tertiary group. It's pretty much when I have multiple different spellcasters that I need to use in the same fight. So maybe in like a PvT, I have most of my army together on control 1. Then 2 will be High Templar for Storm, and then maybe 3 will be Disruptors. Or, maybe I'll switch to the Disruptors or the High Templar, depending on which I went first. And so it's basically just when I have a little bit too much to use all at once. Like I said before, also sometimes I will move the Oracle onto control group 3 once I have High Templar out. Especially in PvZ, I'll have my main control group on 1. I'll have Storm on 2 with my High Templar, and then 3 will be my Oracle because it's still very important for me to be using my Oracle constantly to tag things with Revelation, but I need to have my High Templar on 2 to be able to Storm more easily and keep those alive in case Banelings run by or something like that, while the main army control group can still move around freely and is mostly A-moving. Before we start talking about using your army in an actual engagement and getting the best value out of it, first we need to talk about how to actually move your army, and more specifically your larger armies, with those control groups that we already set up to make sure that you're doing so nice and efficiently. Especially for lower league players that may not be used to using multiple control groups, it can be a little bit difficult to move multiple different armies across the map if you're only used to maybe F2ing all over the place or just using one army control group. So something that's extremely important is something called the rhythm of movement. What this is basically is making it so that your army control and your army movement follows a specific rhythm with the way you're using your keyboard and your mouse to make sure that every single time you're issuing an action, it's actually happening instead of maybe a dud or something like that. So let's say you have the 3 different control groups set up like I was talking about earlier in my setup for a late game army. Basically what this looks like for the rhythm of movement is doing 1 click, 2 click, 3 click in a specific pattern that makes it so that you're not issuing any extra commands and that your army will actually follow those commands in the way that you want them to. Something that I used to do a lot and sometimes still do as well is that I would spam click my control groups and my mouse clicks pretty much at the same time as fast as possible. Especially, this would especially come up when I'm in a bit of a panic situation or I need to disengage from a fight that's not going well. And what I would end up finding is that half of my army would do what I'm trying to tell it to, but the other half would still kind of stick around and still be fighting. And what I realized is that I'm actually cycling through my control groups faster than my mouse hand is clicking the move commands. So what would happen is I would be doing, like I was saying, kind of dud commands where my first army control group and my first mouse click maybe were synchronized properly, but then my second and third were not because I was cycling through them too quickly for my mouse hand to keep up with. And basically what this does is, like I just said, it makes half of your army move and the other one doesn't. So to alleviate this problem, you have to come up with a rhythm of movement. So to make it so that each army, each control group selection and each mouse click for each movement is synchronized properly. So you do one then the other, one then the other. 1 click, 2 click, 3 click. 1 click, 2 click, 3 click. When you do it like this, it makes sure that every single action is being registered properly and efficiently. Nothing is being left behind. Nothing is being completely screwed up because half your army is not following what you want it to do. You just feel a little bit more organized. You feel more efficient. Everything is happening the way you want it to. This is actually something that I mostly noticed after I started watching some more Brood War streams once Brood War Remastered came out. Specifically when I would watch Artosis stream. It's very clear when you watch Artosis stream where this rhythm of movement comes from because you can very easily hear his mouse clicking and on his stream. He does click his mouse very loudly. So to help prove this point a little bit better, here's an example from Artos' stream of him using his rhythm of movement to move a large army across the map. If you listen to the way he hits his keyboard and his mouse and the way the control groups cycle on the bottom UI, you can very clearly hear and see the rhythm of movement with his army control, and you can see how efficient it is and how everything happens exactly how he wants to, and everything is moving in the way that he wants to as well. Now that we have our control groups set up and now that we know how to move around the map with them, now we can start talking about actual engagements. So I'll start by talking about how to set up for an engagement. And this basically is a bit more of a mental thing than a physical thing in terms of mechanics. But I'm just going to talk briefly about organization. So before you end up going into a fight, you want to make sure that everything is nice and organized leading up to it, so that way you can get the best possible outcome. As I was saying before, this is more of a mental thing than a physical thing. There are kind of two different aspects of mechanics, one being the physical, where it's the actual actions happening with the keyboard and the mouse. And then there's the mental aspect of mechanics, where it's more about your thought processes and how you actually think about the game and think about the actions you're about to do before actually doing them. So basically, whenever you're about to go into an engagement, you want to make sure that everything is nice and organized. You want to make sure that your army is all together, and before you're attacking, you want to make sure that everything leading up to the fight is where you want it to be. If you need vision of something, make sure to get vision. If you need a concave, make sure you have a concave set up. If you need more units, then be patient and get more units out. Stuff like that is what I'm talking about. This is an example of a lower league game where the Protoss player was not properly organized going into this fight. You can see there's a lot of lurkers, hydras, and lings coming into this engagement here, but the army sizes themselves are actually quite okay. The Protoss player is in a good advantage here. However, he very hastily goes into this lurker contain here without any observers to check for vision. As you can see in the units tab, there's nothing there that could possibly help with this. If he had instead been a little bit more organized and fell back, waited for the observer, just pulled the probes away, this would have been a totally different situation. Because like I said, the army itself is actually quite small, and if he just had some more units there, specifically the observer, this would have been a completely different situation. Once we're all nice and organized leading up to an engagement, then we can actually go ahead and enact the engagement. And what I'm going to talk about here mostly is the idea of prioritization and the mechanics behind how to prioritize things in a fight. Prioritization is the most important aspect in terms of allowing yourself mentally to know what's happening during a fight. You want to know what the best things to prioritize are in a fight as you go into it to then give you the best outcome. When you have this prioritization set up, it allows your brain to more easily focus in on the fight and the actual micro that's happening, so that way you're not feeling so chaotic during the fight. You don't feel like everything's getting kind of out of control and you don't really know what's happening. If you prioritize things properly, then it gives you a very structured idea for how the fight should actually go, and it makes it just a little bit easier for you to manage. Before I start going into the different examples of how this prioritization can work out, it's important to clarify that in pretty much any situation, A-moving is always going to be the first priority. Just so that your entire army is attacking throughout the entire fight, while you then start to use your different spells and different micro adjustments at the same time. It basically just serves as a default thing that's happening, while you then do everything else layered on top of it. So to explain what I mean with this, I'll start going over a couple of examples that I've just come up with to give you an idea as to what I mean by prioritizing certain actions over others. Let's say, for example 1, we have a Protoss army going against a Terran army that has a lot of liberators at the front, but the rest of the army is pretty easy to deal with once those liberators get dealt with. So in this situation, blinking the stalkers up and shift clicking down the liberators would be the first priority after A moving. For another example, maybe there's a Zerg army that's extremely clumped up, or there's Banelings that are rolling right towards your High Templars. In this scenario, then storming becomes the immediate prioritization after A-moving. If it's really dire, then perhaps then even before A-moving. These scenarios are a little bit simplistic in the amount of actions that are required to complete them. So what if we have an army that is much larger with multiple different spellcasters? In these scenarios, we have to determine what has the highest priority and ease of use. Say you have an army with Disruptors, High Templars, Blink Stalkers, or maybe Tempest or something that you want to focus fire with. Simply come up with a list of prioritization leading up to the fight. Or perhaps you can even come up with a general one that can be used in all late game engagements. And then you basically go through the list one by one once the engagement starts. Let's go over some example prioritization lists for complex Protoss armies. Say we have this extremely complex late game PvT army with just normal gateway units, Disruptors, High Templar, Blink Stalkers, and whatnot. So the list for this type of unit set would basically begin with the A move, like I was saying earlier, Guardian Shield, fire the Disruptor shots, storm with High Templar, blink to the side to target fire, warp in, and then A move again. I'll show this engagement again in slow motion so that you can more easily see all the different actions happening individually. So what we've done here is made a list of prioritization leading up to this fight that we can then easily follow once the fight happens, so that way we stay mentally organized throughout the entire fight. Instead of panicking, this allowed us to get all of our actions off and all of our spells off in a clean and concise manner. Before we move on to another example, it's important to note two things. The first is that every prioritization list always starts with a move, like I mentioned before, but it also almost always ends with an A move as well. What you don't see, however, is multiple different A moves happening within the list itself. It's not good to spam A moves in a fight, because then you might be resetting too many different actions prior to that, and you're also just being redundant. You don't need to be A moving so many times during a fight. Instead, what you should be doing is just doing one A move at the beginning to make sure everything is happening, and then one A move at the end to make sure that once all the actions are finished, everything is still firing, and especially if you brought in additional reinforcements with warp-ins or something, that to make sure that those are firing as well and doing things. Another example of a prioritization list will be for PvZ. So say we have this large late game Protoss army. First, we would start with an A move. Then we would feed back Vipers or Overseers that are coming towards us. Then we would move the targeted mothership back. We would storm the Hydras, and then we would A move once again. Here it is in slow motion, so that way you can look at it a little bit more clearly. As with anything in StarCraft, the more you find yourself in these similar scenarios, the more practice you'll get and the better you'll develop your muscle memory, to where you don't even really need to think about the actual prioritization list itself. Coming up with the list is basically just a way to ease yourself into it, so that way it's a little bit simpler to get used to using larger armies. There's also two different types of actions happening in these fights and in these lists. There are some that are a little bit more automatic, which are kind of like the A moves and the Guardian Shields happening right at the beginning. Those should be happening pretty much very easily. You don't really have to think very hard at all about doing those. Then there's also ones that are a little bit more manual and a little bit more flexible in how they work. And they don't always need to go in the same spot every time. This is specifically talking about warp-ins. There will be some fights where you really can't take any time at all to do a warp-in. You need to do a lot of different things first before that comes in. There are some fights where really not that much is happening at all, and you really can just do a couple actions and then warp in and then just do another A move. So that's where the experience comes in, and you have to really figure out a best spot to put the warp-ins into different scenarios. And the more you do it, again, the more easy that'll come and the more naturally that'll come for you. It's also important to note that sometimes you'll have more things in a fight to do that are actually worth doing. For example, in later game fights, it's not normal to have sentries anymore, but sometimes you find yourself with them, and it's really not worth it to do things other than Guardian Shield. You don't have to do force fields in every single engagement if they're not really going to give you that much value, or if there are other things that are easier to do and would give you more value to the fight. Another thing would be adepts. They don't really need to be shaded in the middle of fights or anything like that, so that's not something you have to worry about. Or just because you have 5 different abilities that you can activate in a certain fight doesn't mean you have to activate all of them to win a certain engagement. You should prioritize things above others so that way you find a balance between effectiveness and ease of use. To start to wrap up this video, I'll talk very briefly about how to disengage from a fight. When disengaging, the most important thing to remember is to go back to the rhythm of movement that we set up earlier on in the video. Basically, when you're disengaging, you don't want to accidentally leave half of your army behind because we didn't issue a command to it. Other than that, there's not much that needs to go into how to properly disengage. There will be some specific scenarios or unique scenarios where you'll need to micro some things a little bit better. Sometimes it's better to do some stutter step micro as you go back. But in general, just make sure you're doing everything cleanly and concisely so that way nothing is happening that you don't want to happen. Other than the rhythm of movement, we also talked about how to set up control groups and the different methods of controlling those armies, whether that be with different control groups or putting them all on one and using tab, doing a combination of the two or what have you. We also talked about how to move those large armies and move them with the control groups, specifically, like I was saying, with the rhythm of movement. We were also talking about how to set up for engagements briefly. Then we also spent a lot of time talking about enacting the engagement and how important prioritization is in making sure that engagements go the way we want to. Always remember that A moving should always be first on the list of any prioritization. Always make sure you're A moving so that way you have a default command happening for then others to be layered on top of. If you have that set up and you're doing the rest of your actions properly, you should have a nice clean engagement. If you wrap that all up with another nice big A move, you should be able to be collecting plenty of Terran, Zerg, or Protoss tiers, whichever you want, and hopefully being able to close it out with some nice big MMR boosts as well. So thank you everyone for watching. If you have any feedback or any requests for future mechanics videos, feel free to leave them in the comments or just message me anywhere on Twitter, Reddit, whatever. And I hope that this was helpful for anyone that was interested in the mechanics behind army control. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next video. I'd also like to take a moment to thank a new sponsor that is helping to make these videos happen. AFKTea, which is headed by Lycan, is a new tea company designed to give gamers a more healthy alternative to energy drinks and the like while they're playing. So be sure to check them out with the referral link in the description or just at afktea.com. And if you use the promo code Gemini, you get a 25% discount off your purchase for the next 2 weeks. And then after that, it's 15% off. And a portion of the proceeds also goes over to me, which is great. So with their help, I'll be making more regular videos like this one, and I hope you guys go ahead and check them out.